A sudden sob, the echo of a profound sorrow. This was not merely a funeral ceremony, it was a moment where pride and tradition were shattered. How do tears breach the walls of discipline? How heavy is the burden on a young guard's shoulders that it makes even hearts of stone ache? What truth lies hidden beneath the commander's stern gaze? What dark tales do the secrets of these tears conceal within the depths of the monarchy? Could this moment of weakness, during one of the Empire's most magnificent ceremonies, be the harbinger of a storm that will change everything? What will be the consequences of this catastrophic mistake? When protocol is broken, where does true heroism hide? These unanswered questions are poised to uncover the deepest secrets of an ancient kingdom. Follow us as we pull back the curtain on this enigmatic event together. Every subscription, every notification, will help us better understand a piece of this hidden history. Remember, the greatest truths often emerge in the most unexpected moments. Subscribe to our channel and turn on notifications so you don't miss the continuation of this astonishing story. The king was dead. The capital, nestled within its centuries-old walls, had transformed into a colossal monument, holding its breath. A cold morning chill rose from the marble floors, sharpening the heavy silence that descended upon the mourning crowd. At the very heart of this silence stood the young guard, Kael. The silver armor on his shoulders was crushing him, not just with the weight of metal, but with the invisible pressure of the responsibility he carried and the thousands of eyes upon him. On every polished surface of his armor, he could see the city's mournful silhouette and his own anxious reflection. If you want to see what depths this story will take you to, and who will emerge victorious in the war between honor and prejudice, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and let us know in the comments where in the world you're joining us from. For Kael, at that moment, the world consisted of only two things. First, the sacred duty he had to perform without the slightest deviation, and second, just a few steps away, the presence of Commander Thorne, whose very shadow seemed more imposing than the man himself. With his black, ornate leather armor and a scar from an old dwar etched across his face, Commander Thorne was the embodiment of discipline and unwavering will. Seconds before the ceremony began, as the crowd's murmur momentarily subsided, Thorne approached Kael with the calmness of a stormy sea and whispered words no one else could hear, but which pierced Kael's soul like a dagger. There is no room for weakness today. A single mistake will be the shame not only of you, but of your lineage. These words were far more than a simple warning. The shame of your lineage. The phrase echoed relentlessly in Kael's mind. He was one of the few black-skinned guards in this elite unit. He knew that every day, every moment, he was responsible not just for his own actions, but for everything he represented. Among the thousands of eyes, he could feel some gazes piercing not just his uniform, but the color of the skin beneath it. That was why there was no room for error. He had no such luxury. He had to be perfect, because the smallest flaw on his part would be generalized as proof in the eyes of others. As the poison of Thorne's words spread through his veins, Kael discreetly clenched his left fist. In his palm was a small wooden bird, smoothed by years of touch. It was a simple toy the late king had gifted him when he was just a child, playing in the palace gardens. The king had spoken to him not like a commander, but with the tenderness of a father, saying, "The strongest wings are the ones that beat the quietest, young man." That little wooden bird was the true identity Kael hid beneath his uniform and armor. He was not just a guard, but also a grieving son. This small secret gave him the strength to endure. His right hand, gripping the cold steel of his spear, represented his duty. His left hand, clenching the hidden wooden bird, represented his heart. Today, he had to strike a terrible balance between the two. As the heavy, rhythmic steps of the ceremonial procession began to sound, Kael tried to regulate his breath. He fixed his gaze on the stone wall opposite, striving to clear his mind, to focus solely on protocol. But it was impossible. The suppressed sobs from the crowd, the cold scent of incense filling his nostrils, and above all, the weight of knowing the king's ornate coffin was slowly approaching, carried on shoulders, all of it was tearing down his defenses. With every step, his heart hammered against his ribs like a sledgehammer. This was not just a duty. This was the final journey of a man who had believed in him, who had given him an identity. And he had to stand through this journey like a statue, without showing the slightest sign of emotion. Commander Thorne's steel-like gaze was on the back of his neck, as if hunting for a moment of weakness, a crumb of hesitation. Kael knew he was facing the most difficult test of his life. A test not of sword or shield, but of the unshakable fortitude of spirit and will. What do you think is the heaviest burden a person can carry, the armor on their back, or the prejudiced gazes of others? Is true strength found in suppressing one's emotions, or in confronting them and managing to stand tall? Share your thoughts with us. As the coffin, carried on the shoulders of 8 elite guards, drew level with Kael in slow, solemn steps. Time seemed to thicken and freeze. The velvety purple of the royal banner draped over it took on a deeper, more sorrowful meaning in the pale, grey light of the morning. Kael felt that the few seconds it took for the king's body to pass directly in front of him stretched into an eternity, each moment seared indelibly into his mind. In that instant, a memory from years ago flashed through his mind like lightning, the day the king had knelt under the pine tree in the garden, speaking to him at eye level. The king's deep but weary voice was in his ears as he placed the wooden bird in his small palms. The strongest wings are the ones that beat the quietest, young man. Honor does not shout, it is felt in one's bearing. That smile, that voice full of wisdom, was now silenced forever behind a carved wooden coffin. The grief that fell like a burning coal into his heart instantly multiplied the weight of the silver armor and the responsibility on his shoulders 1,000-fold. The cold air he drew into his lungs knotted in his throat. Protocol was like the blood in his veins, it commanded emotionlessness, absolute control. His mind, forged by the merciless steel discipline of years of training, screamed, "Do not move, do not react, do not feel, be nothing but a machine of duty." But his heart was a wounded prisoner, rebelling against this command, trying to break its bars. The smooth wooden bird in his palm felt as if it had come to life, it burned his skin, whispering to him that he was human, that he had the right to mourn, to feel pain. At the most violent, most brutal moment of this internal war, he heard the deep, detached voice of Commander Thorne, devoid of all emotion. Thorne wasn't speaking to Kael, but to an old, white-bearded nobleman standing next to him, clad in silk, surveying the scene with a disdainful expression. His voice was low, but to Kael's hypersensitive ears, it was as clear as thunder, and every word was a poisoned arrow. Inexperienced boys cause blood loss. On the battlefield and on the ceremonial ground, ornate armor cannot hide a weak spirit. This sentence was like a giant battering ram, demolishing all the mental walls Kael had so carefully and painfully constructed. Inexperienced boy. Weak spirit. These words brutally summarized Thorne's view of him, perhaps the hidden view of many in the palace. Years of arduous training, countless drills with bleeding hands, protocols memorized on sleepless nights, the sweat and blood shed in the toughest exercises. All of it was crushed and rendered meaningless under the shadow of those few words. In the commander's eyes, he was still just a boy, no matter how bright his uniform, no matter how solid his stance appeared, his skin color and young age made him nothing but a risk, a blood loss. In that moment, his world collapsed. The profound grief that had pierced his heart gave way to a more searing, more bitter disappointment and shame. The loss of the king was a personal sorrow, but the commander's words were an attack on his entire existence, his entire effort. All his strength, his will, even the last crumbs of self-belief, drained from his veins. The steel spear, which for years he had carried as an extension of his body, which had become one with him, suddenly felt alien, a cruel anchor of immense weight pulling him down. His fingers, inside the sweat-slicked gauntlet, went numb. His grip, against his will, loosened. Time seemed to stretch like rubber, slowing down. Before his eyes, in horrifying slow motion, he watched the polished silver spear slip through his fingers, sickeningly aware of every single moment. It was as if the air itself resisted, trying to slow the metal's descent, but gravity was merciless. He couldn't make a move to catch it, his body had betrayed his mind, his heart had betrayed his duty. The spear traced a silent, deadly arc toward the impeccably polished marble floor at Kael's feet. And then came the sound. A sharp, metallic, agonizing clang that shattered the sanctity of the silence and mourning like glass. That sound was not just the sound of a falling spear. It was the sound of a guard's honor shattering into 1,000 pieces on the ground. It was the bitter melody of the collapse of Kael's career, his dreams, and everything he had built until that moment by clawing his way up. That single, discordant note, echoing in the middle of the sacred ceremony, was enough to make thousands of people gasp in unison. All heads, like an army of puppets, turned toward the source of the sound. Grieving eyes transformed in a second into looks of shock, anger, and ice-cold contempt. The noble's frigid scorn, the crowd's disappointed whispers, the stunned, blank expressions of the other guards. Kael suddenly found himself before tens of thousands of judges, defenseless and naked. He didn't need to see Commander Thorne's face, the glacial fury he felt on the back of his neck said it all. The crowd's hateful whispers began to fill his ears like the hissing of snakes. Disgrace. Disrespectful. How could he? Kael, right there, in that very moment, wished for the earth to split open and swallow him in his shame. Can a single moment of weakness erase a lifetime of dedication and discipline? In the darkest moment of shame, what keeps a person standing, protocol, or an ancient voice from the depths of the heart? Share your thoughts on this difficult choice with us in the comments. Time seemed to congeal within that shameful moment. As the metallic shriek of the fallen spear echoed repeatedly in the square's dome, branding Kael's soul, the world lost its colors and sounds for him, blurring into a hazy smudge. The collective weight of thousands of eyes was more crushing, more suffocating than the silver armor on his shoulders. It felt as if it were piercing his skin and pulverizing his bones. The icy disgust on the nobles' faces, the crowd's anger mixed with disappointment, and worst of all, the shock and shame on the faces of the other guards in his own unit. Every gaze was an invisible dagger plunging into Kael's heart, driving deeper with every breath. The world was reduced to that single, silver mistake gleaming at his feet, a monument to his stained honor. Inside his mind, chaos and panic erupted like a ruthless storm. Years of training, an instinctual reflex, screamed the same command at him, almost in Commander Thorne's voice: pick up the spear. Now. Correct your posture. Guards Code, Article 17, a guard's weapon never touches the ground. Re-establish protocol. This was the voice of discipline, the voice of survival instinct. To bend down in a panic, to eliminate the mistake as quickly as possible, to hide again behind the mask of the flawless, faceless guard. It was the logical, the expected thing to do. But Kael couldn't move. His legs were like ancient trees rooted to the earth. As his eyes remained locked on the spear on the ground, the familiar warmth of the small, smooth wooden bird in his left palm slowly spread through his frozen body. In that instant, the storm in his mind subsided, replaced by a strange, calm, almost ethereal clarity. He could feel the grain of the wooden toy, the points where the king's fingers had touched it years ago. The spear represented his duty, his uniform, his identity as a guard, and that identity now lay broken and tarnished on the ground for all to see. To pick it up would be to desperately cling to this broken identity, to try to pretend nothing had happened. It would be a lie, a sham. Because something had happened. He was not just a guard who had violated his duty, he was Kael, bidding farewell to a man he loved, a king who had believed in him and seen his potential. And his grief was too great, too real to fit into the emotionless mold imposed by protocol. Commander Thorne's cruel words came to mind: inexperienced boy. Weak spirit. Perhaps he was right. Perhaps Kael was too fragile for this world of steel and protocol. But in that moment, he understood that this fragility was not a weakness, but the purest proof of his humanity. To try to hide his mistake, to take refuge behind protocol, would be the greatest cowardice. Instead, he decided to honor his mistake and the truth behind it, his grief. Under the astonished and angry gazes of everyone, Kael did something incredible. He cast a final look at the spear on the ground, not with contempt, but with acceptance, and then summoned his will. He slowly straightened his body, which had been bent with panic and shame, as if he were in the presence of a king. He threw his shoulders back, standing tall and straight. Then, he slowly and with great reverence placed his left hand, the hand that concealed the wooden bird, over his heart, on the cold metal of his armor. He bowed his head, not with pride, but with deep reverence and sorrow. This was the most sacred mourning ritual of his people, of his ancestors, a vow that sealed the truth in the heart and honored what came from the soul. This gesture said more than words ever could. It meant, I have made a mistake, I have failed in my duty, but I am sincere in my grief. It meant, I have broken your protocol, but I have never broken my loyalty and love for my king. It meant, you may see me as a boy, but my heart beats with the honor of a man. The humming and whispering in the square was cut short as if by a knife. It was replaced by a dense, almost audible silence, filled with astonishment and uncertainty. No one could make sense of this unexpected, extra-protocolary action. Was it a rebellion? Madness? Or a deeper sign of respect they could not comprehend? The crowd was suspended between anger and curiosity. The expression of icy fury on Commander Thorne's face flickered for a moment, replaced by a sharp, unreadable astonishment. He had not expected this. He had expected panic, pleading, collapse. But before him stood a guard who owned his mistake in all its nakedness and had transformed it into a deeper, more personal display of loyalty. This was not a moment of weakness, but an unexpected show of strength. When protocol collapses, what makes a person honorable? Blind adherence to rules, or loyalty to the deepest truth of one's heart? Is true courage trying to hide a mistake, or owning it before the whole world and being ready to pay the price? Share your thoughts in the comments. As Kael stood, head bowed, hand over his heart, a statue outside of time and space, the ceremony continued to flow around him like a cold river. The king's coffin slowly passed by him, the mournful procession followed, but Kael saw none of it. He couldn't. He was locked in his own silent vow, his own moment of honor. The outside world was just a humming, meaningless noise. This frozen moment was broken by a firm, commanding action. One of the reserve guards next to him stepped forward without a word, with no sign of pity or anger on his face. He picked up the fallen spear with a careful but mechanical motion, as if handling a venomous snake, and moved into the position Kael had vacated. Simultaneously, another ranking officer touched Kael's elbow with his fingertips, as if touching something unclean, and whispered in a voice of ice, "Fall back." It was not a request, but a condemnation, a declaration that the unit no longer considered him one of their own. Kael awoke from his trance-like state. He slowly lowered his hand from his heart. When he raised his head, he no longer had the courage to look anyone in the face. A void had formed around him, as if he were an invisible leper. He had no choice but to follow the steps of the soldier escorting him. Every step he took away from that magnificent ceremonial ground, away from those thousands of eyes, was a burning coal in the fire of his shame. As he entered through the massive palace gates, leaving the sunny square behind and plunging into the palace's shadowed, cold corridors, the portraits of old kings on the walls seemed to follow him with their oil-painted eyes, silently judging him. He could feel the stares boring into his back, the buzzing whispers, and the single word hammering relentlessly in his mind like a sledgehammer, "Traitor." As he moved deeper into the palace's inner corridors, the sounds of the outside world grew muffled and finally ceased altogether. He was brought to a cold, stone room smelling of damp, with an iron-barred window, containing only a wooden bench and a small table. The door closed behind him with a heavy, final thud. The sound of the lock turning was like the sealing of his fate. The creaking metal announced the end of a chapter of his life. And then the waiting began. Time was no longer a flowing river, but an instrument of torture, each drop driving him toward madness. Minutes turned into hours, hours into a century. From outside, he heard the muffled, gut-vibrating sounds of the cannon fire signaling the end of the ceremony. Then the ceaseless hum of the dispersing crowd, the grinding of carriage wheels on the stone pavement, the sharp, clear military commands shouted in the barracks yard. Every sound was a cruel reminder of the fact that he had been cast out, severed from the world he belonged to, from the life to which he had dedicated everything. Inside, there was only the sound of his own ragged breath, his throbbing temples, and the despair swallowed by the stone walls. He began to pace back and forth in the room. In his mind, he relived that moment again and again, in every detail. The spear slipping from his fingers, that horrible clang, the poison of Thorne's words, the collective hatred on the faces of the crowd. Had he done the wrong thing? In trying to save his honor, had he set fire to everything, his future, his family's hopes, the chance to be an inspiration to others who would walk this path after him? Thorne's warning gnawed at his mind like a worm, the shame of your lineage. Perhaps his greatest betrayal was not to the king or the protocol, but to the people who had leaned on him, who had expected him to be a beacon of hope. He put his hand in his pocket and took out the wooden bird. In the cold room, that small piece of wood was the only source of warmth. Looking at it, he remembered the king's wise eyes, the warm smile on his wrinkled face. What would the king have said? Would he have seen this act as disrespect, or as a devotion from the heart that went beyond protocol? There were no answers to these questions. Only the cold walls of uncertainty and the crushing weight of his impending punishment. What was the hardest moment you ever had to wait to face the consequences of a decision you made? What went through your mind during that wait? Share your experiences and thoughts in the comments and join Kael in his lonely vigil. The sharp white light of the midday sun slanting through the iron bars turned to the tired yellow of the afternoon, then to the blood-red farewell of sunset. Kael collapsed onto the wooden bench from exhaustion and spiritual depletion. He wasn't thinking anymore, he was just feeling. A cold, naked fear that seeped into his bones. Just as he was beginning to lose hope, surrendering to the darkness, he heard the sound of heavy, rhythmic, determined boots echoing down the corridor. The steps were like those of a predator cornering its prey. And they stopped right in front of his door. Kael's heart stopped for a beat, then began to pound as if it would break through his ribcage. The moment had come. The lock on the door screeched as it turned. The heavy oak door swung wide open. Before him stood a guard, ramrod straight, his face as expressionless as stone. His eyes avoided meeting Kael's. As Kael braced himself to hear his death sentence, the guard gave only a short, curt command, "Commander Thorne is waiting for you. Come with me." Following the cold, silent guard, Kael felt like a condemned man, each step bringing him closer to the guillotine. The torch-lit corridors of the palace, which normally filled him with pride and a sense of belonging, now felt like the menacing arms of a labyrinth. The shadows danced on the walls, seeming to mock him. The way every century they passed averted their gaze hammered home the fact that he was an outcast, an invisible pariah, no longer a part of that honorable brotherhood. This walk was the longest and most agonizing journey of his life. Finally, they arrived at the heavy, iron-wrought door of the chamber Commander Thorne used as his headquarters, a room completely devoid of ornament and ostentation. The guard knocked. A deep enter came from within. The guard opened the door, ushered Kael inside, and closed it behind him without a single word. Kael was now alone in the beast's den. The room was exactly like the commander, practical, harsh, and unemotional. Military maps showing all four corners of the kingdom hung on the walls. In one corner stood an armor rack with polished swords and armor, in another, a modest bookshelf filled with tomes on strategy. Commander Thorne was not sitting at the large oak desk in the center of the room, he stood with his back to Kael, at the single window overlooking the city lights. "Your orders, Commander," Kael said, holding his breath. His voice came out weaker and more tremulous than he'd expected. Thorne didn't answer for a while. The silence was worse than any torture. In Kael's mind, the most horrific scenarios of his punishment played out, being stripped of his rank, dishonorably discharged, thrown in the dungeon, perhaps even being accused of treason. Finally, Thorne turned slowly to face him. His face was, as always, a hard, unreadable mask. His eyes seemed to bore into the very depths of Kael's soul. He began to speak in a deep, emotionless voice, each word like the fall of a judge's gavel. "Today, you made 3 of the gravest mistakes a guard can make, Kael. You dropped your weapon, a sign of a novice. You broke formation, a sign of indiscipline. And most importantly, you disrupted the flow of the ceremony at a royal guard's most sacred moment. That is an unforgivable disrespect." Kael bowed his head. There was nothing to say. He knew every accusation was utterly justified. "I am ready for my punishment, whatever it may be, Commander." Thorne walked to his desk, picked up a small dagger he used as a letter opener, and began toying with it. The only sound in the room was the soft tap of metal against the wood. Then, something happened that Kael would never forget for the rest of his life. Thorne's voice lost its hard, icy tone. In its place came a weary but profound timbre he had never heard before. "I was testing you, Kael." Kael looked up in shock. His eyes were wide, trying to comprehend what the commander was saying. Thorne continued, "Those words I said to you before the ceremony. The shame of your lineage. The remark I made next to that nobleman about inexperienced boys. They were all bait. Lures I cast out to see the man beneath the armor." Kael's mind was reeling. Was this a dream? A trap? Thorne walked back to the window. "To protect this palace, this kingdom, I don't need flawless statues who have memorized protocols, Kael. I can train hundreds of those. I need men whose hearts tell them the right thing to do under pressure, in the most difficult moment. When you dropped the spear, for a second, I thought I had been wrong. I thought the boy had truly broken under pressure." The commander turned to Kael again, and in that moment, Kael saw in his eyes not anger, but a rare glimmer of respect he had never seen before. "But you didn't reach for the spear. You didn't try to cover your mistake in a panic. Instead, you stood. And you honored your heart and your grief, as your ancestors did. In that moment, I understood that your loyalty is not to the rule book I wrote, but to the values for which that book was written. Your loyalty is not to the king's crown, but to the king's soul." Thorne stood before the desk, put down the dagger, and clasped his hands behind his back. "This kingdom will be protected not by those who are blindly loyal to protocol, but by those who are loyal to their hearts and the values they believe in, Kael. Because protocols are forgotten in battle, but character never is. Your mistake did not make you the weakest link in this unit. On the contrary, your reaction to that mistake has made you the most honorable guard in this unit. What is true leadership, in your opinion? Is it the one who enforces rules blindly, or the one who seeks the spirit and character behind those rules? What do you think of Commander Thorne's dangerous and ruthless method? Join us in the comments." Kael was utterly frozen, stunned by the incredible words that fell from Commander Thorne's lips. The most honorable guard. The words hung in the heavy air of the room, echoed off the walls of Kael's mind, and shattered every truth he had known, every reality he had believed in, like glass. The colossal weight of shame, failure, and betrayal that had been crushing his shoulders like a mountain suddenly, magically, evaporated, replaced by a dizzying, almost stupefying lightness. He only realized it when the terrible tension he had been holding inside for hours, the vice grip of fear on his soul, the suffocating grief, finally found a way out. Trickling from his eyes is a single tear that slid down his cheek. This was not a tear of weakness or helplessness, it was a sacred drop of his soul's purification, of its release from all that pressure, of its rebirth from the ashes. Without feeling the need to wipe that single tear from his face, he looked straight into Commander Thorne's eyes for the first time in his life. He was no longer a trembling novice looking at him with fear, but a man who had passed the most arduous test of his life and had understood. The hard man he had feared like a monster for years had turned out to be not his greatest judge, but his sharpest and wisest teacher. Thorne saw Kael's silent but all-telling gaze. The granite-hard expression on his face seemed to soften for an instant, then returned to its usual disciplined form. A kingdom is protected not by stone walls, but by men of character, Kael. Walls crumble, armies scatter. But character remains standing even amongst the ruins. A guard's most important weapon is not his spear or his sword. His most important weapon is what remains when the uniform comes off. Today, you prove to the entire world, but more importantly, to yourself, that you possess an unbreakable character beneath your armor. The commander returned to his desk and from a drawer took out a small, silver emblem engraved with the ancient symbol of the unit. It was an honor not found in official records, given only in the most exceptional circumstances at a commander's own initiative, the highest mark of distinction. He walked over to Kael and pressed the insignia not onto his chest, but into the palm of his hand. "You will not wear this on your uniform," he said in a deep voice. "This is not a medal given by kings, but a vow given between warriors. You will carry this over your heart. Let it remind you every day that rules are for the body, but loyalty is for the soul." Kael felt the cold, distinct weight of the medal in his palm. This was not just an insignia, it was the turning point of his life, the seal of his rewritten destiny. The commander turned and walked back to the window. "Now go. Return to the barracks and rest. At dawn tomorrow, you will be on the Royal Standard Watch. It is the most visible, most honorable duty in the palace. And there is now no one more worthy of that duty than you." This was not a pardon, but a promotion. Not a favor, but an honor earned with blood and tears. Kael swallowed the lump in his throat. "Thank you, Commander," he said. His voice, try as he might, trembled with gratitude this time, but it was steady. He snapped a salute, turned, and walked out the door. The corridor no longer felt dark and menacing as it had when he arrived. The light from the torches seemed like beacons of hope illuminating his path. The guard waiting for him at the door did not avert his eyes this time. Just as Kael passed him, the guard stopped and, under Kael's astonished gaze, gave a crisp, military nod. In his eyes was a knowing respect. That small gesture was the greatest proof that everything had changed. After that night, a legend began to spread in whispers among the royal guards, the protocol of the heart. The story of the young guard who dropped his spear at the king's funeral but never dropped his honor. Kael's mistake had become a symbol not of his cowardice, but of his deepest loyalty. Kael did not sleep that night. Instead, he went down to the quiet armory of the barracks. In the torchlight, he looked at his reflection on the breastplate of his gleaming armor. In it, he no longer saw a frightened boy, but the beginning of the man of character Commander Thorne had spoken of. He opened his palm. In one hand was the honor insignia from the commander, in the other, the wooden bird from the king. One reminded him of where he came from, his humanity, and his heart, the other, where he needed to go, his duty, and his honor. And Kael understood, for the first time, that these two were not enemies, but two parts of a whole. True strength was the ability to forge an unshakable balance between them. If this story moved you, don't forget to like our video, subscribe to our channel, and turn on notifications to stay informed about our new stories. Share your thoughts and the lessons you've drawn from this story with us in the comments. Remember, the greatest honor lies not in never making a mistake, but in being able to turn your deepest wound into your strongest shield, and your greatest shame into your brightest metal.